Hi, this is Scott Ferguson, Managing Editor for Information Security Media Group. Welcome to today's session entitled Unlocking CIAM, the Secret to Balancing Frictionless Registration and High Data Integrity. We'll be featuring Mickey Martin. He is the Principal Sales Engineer at Onfido. Before I introduce our speaker, just a bit of background on today's session. Expectations of online businesses have never been higher. Customers expect more personalization experiences and a high platform security while demanding more streamlined registration processes. And if they don't get them, they'll take their business elsewhere. The result is that businesses are experiencing a profound tension. How do you balance frictionless registration and effective identity management so that customers are more than just an email and password in a database? And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Mickey Martin. He is the Principal Sales Engineer at Onfido. Mickey is an expert in identity access management, identity proofing, and effective customer registration processes. He's also built extensive experience in the identity space, previously working at ForgeRock, Oracle, and Transmit Security. Mickey now works as Onfido's Principal Sales Engineer, helping the company to understand how identity verification and identity access management can solve business-critical problems for their clients. And with that, I turn today's presentation over to Mickey. Mickey, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott, for the intro. I'm definitely going to talk a little bit more about myself, just to give you guys a background on what CIAM actually is and where I actually came from in the industry, so that you guys can see how identity proofing will actually relate to CIAM. So if you're out there and you've keyed into this webinar because you actually typed in the letter CIAM, it's going to be a little bit of a review for you guys, but if you're out there and you just happen to stumble across it, CIAM or CIAM is an acronym for Customer Identity and Access Management. The companies that you've seen that I've worked for previously were all CIAM companies. They had products and built user experiences for customer identity and access management. A few of them you might be familiar with, you may or may not. But basically, if I wanted to boil it down to the simplest way, CIAM is all about collecting identities, making sure those identities are all in sync, keeping up with them. And then the access side of it is utilizing that identity to decide what a user can and can't do inside of your system. So whether you are a CIAM expert or an identity and access management expert, you've definitely interacted with CIAM. We've all logged into a website somewhere. We've all signed up for a service somewhere where we had to type in usernames and passwords and give our first name, last names, possibly even date of births and addresses, depending on what the service was. Going back to that identity and access management world, a lot of identity and access management, especially on the access management side, today we are all focused on trying to build a better mousetrap is what it comes down to. We are trying to figure out what's better than username and passwords. The CIAM world is trying to figure out which multi-factor is better than the other multi-factor, whether that be the one-time passwords that we're all familiar with text messages, or whether that be the new things like push notifications or selfie biometrics or utilizing Face ID. We're all trying to figure out which one's the better MFA or which one's the better risk engine. A lot of risk engines or risk capabilities that you'll see in these CIAM platforms are all about making sure that it's the same entity coming in over and over again. So in risk, when you're tying that to CIAM, we try to make sure that you're coming from the same device that we normally see you come from. We try to make sure that you're coming from the same geolocation that you normally come from. We're also trying to see if you're coming from the same IP address that you normally come from. The problem with that in the CIAM world is that we never actually prove that it's a real person sitting there doing these things. We've built these mousetraps that are very good at deciding it's the same thing coming over and over again. We're very good at deciding it's the same iPhone or it's the same iPhone emulator coming in over and over again. But we never actually proved that the thing that initiated the interaction with your company, whether it be a registration process or a sign-on process, was an actual human to start with. And that's kind of where I came in and started looking at identity verification or identity proofing, depending on how long you've been in the industry. The terms are changing, as they always tend to do, but that's the only part inside of the identity lifecycle management that really focuses on proving that it is an actual human being sitting there, and that actual human being can be tied back to a verified process, a verified identity somewhere in a government. So that's where unlocking CIAM, the secret to balance frictionless registration and high data integrity actually came from. We're looking at this identity verification to be able to provide us with these verified identities, with these valid attributes from the government. But in the past, these types of processes have been fraught with friction and issues due to legacy ways and legacy thinking. Talking about some of those different legacy approaches that we're probably all familiar with when it comes to identity proofing. If we think way back to the brick and mortar days, identity proofing was you showing up in person. If you can remember back when you used to sign up for a bank account, you used to go to your hometown bank. You would walk in, you would tell the teller that you would like to open a bank account today, and your identity proofing, especially if you grew up in a small town like I did, your identity proofing was, I've known your parents for 20 years. I know you're a person. Let's get you a bank account. You're safe with us. The problem with that is that today's high demand world doesn't really portray these brick and mortars anymore. No one actually wants to go into a bank. No one actually wants to go in to sign up for things anymore. I do remember, I don't know if you guys have bought a car recently, but now when you buy a car and you want to look at mortgage rates, interest rates, you don't even have to have a relationship with the bank. The guy at the dealership can hit a button, pull up a bunch of interest rates. You say yes, and you now have a loan from a bank you've never actually walked into. So that in-person proofing, it doesn't really work anymore. It's completely outdated. I think the only place where in-person proofing is still used is in the government for your CAC and TIV cards. And if you want to look up the cost for that, it's completely public, and you can see how expensive it is for companies to be able to do this. So this process itself has kind of been moved out of the world. Now, what we moved on to was traditional databases. So I think everyone that's on this talk is probably familiar with this process. This is the one that we all think about. This is the one that gave everyone the bad taste in their mouth when it came to identity proofing. It was reliant on the credit databases. So that's when you guys were signing up for a bank service, maybe online, or trying to do something that was high risk online, and all of a sudden 3 to 8 questions, maybe 10 questions would pop up on a screen, and you would have to answer those to prove that you really are who you say you are. The problem with those types of questions was they were based on a risk profile that you would have to tweak as an administrator. And it went from 2 very different ranges. Sometimes the questions themselves were so easy that anybody could answer them. So you would have a low assurance rate. So if you ran into some of these questions, you might have been at one time asked, what type of car do you own? And it would be hitting a credit database to see if you've ever had a mortgage on that car, or if you've actually bought that car, if there's a title registered to your name on that car. Problem with that is that your neighbor could answer that. Half of your friends could answer that. And depending on how much you post on Facebook, everybody on Facebook would be able to answer that question. So they started tweaking the profiles up, and then you get the harder questions, the ones that actually gave you a higher level of assurance of that user trying to sign up. Problem with those is a lot of people couldn't actually answer those questions. And those were the questions that came in if you've ever been asked in an identity proofing scenario where they would say, what's your mortgage rate on the house that you purchased in 2013? To be honest with you, if that came up to me and someone answered that correctly, they're probably the fraudster, because I have no idea what the mortgage rate is on a house from 7 years ago. I know what I'm paying every month. I don't know what the mortgage rate is. So those 2 sliders made it very bad. You either had that low assurance rate where it was easy for people to go through the process so they didn't actually drop out, or you had that high assurance, tough question where a lot of people were actually dropping out of the process because they were saying, look, I can't answer these questions. I'm not going to dig out paperwork in a filing cabinet that's been stored away. And they would just decide they didn't want the service. So these are the ones that I think that a lot of people, this is where identity proofing, everyone said, oh, this is a great idea. We've digitalized identity proofing. But then the industry had actually moved on because they just decided it was bugging their users too much. It was affecting their dropout rates. It was either, like I said, low assurance and very easy, or high assurance, and people were deciding to not sign up for a service or not identity proof themselves. So in effect, it became where it wasn't effective. There were some other things that went on with databases that we'll talk about in a little bit that kind of changed this and made it where we had to move on to a new process, but I'll bring that up a little bit later. So here's where the new generation came in. These new generation identity verifiers, or these identity proofers like Untitled. This generation decided that, we got to come up with a process that puts it back in the hands of the users. Let's not base it on credit report and credit data that's stored in the database somewhere that may or may not be correct, that the users have no control over. Let's put it back in their hands where they can do something. And then we're going to use the strong verification of a document, because you had to prove to your DMV or to your government, your federal government, if we're talking about the US, that you are who you are to get a passport or to get a driver's license. So we can actually use that to have strong verification. And then we can also call back out to those government databases to make sure that the information on that driver's license actually matches what we've been able to read off of it. So you have a couple different filters that you can check there, where you're actually checking to make sure the document itself is valid, and checking to make sure that it hasn't been tampered. And then you can turn around and check that the information on that document matches what the government database says should be on that document, so that you can get that strong verification of the user. Another thing that went on is they also added in biometrics to this type of identity verification. They wanted users, and you can see here on the screen that I have, and I'll go through each one of these steps, but we want users to be able to take a picture of themselves so we can actually match them back to that document. That was something that the database identity proofing wasn't able to do. All they could do was prove that the person was answering the questions. It was something that in person could do, but it was too expensive. So this is going to get you the best of both worlds. So you can see here what a new generation identity proofing process could be inside of registration services. So a user can submit the front and back of their ID so that the document can be analyzed for fraud and the data can be extracted directly from the source. So when you're actually going through this process, the user, instead of typing in all of that information that we normally ask for, whether you need it to store it in the user profile or whether you need it to hand over to the databases so they can provide those particular questions for identity proofing, we've actually taken that out of the equation. If the user snaps the picture of the front and back of their driver's license, then we're actually getting all of that data. We don't have to ask the user where they live. We don't have to ask what their age is. We don't have to ask their date of birth for validation. We don't have to ask their first name, last name, or middle name. All of that information is available to you because they had to take the picture. The next step is always, it doesn't have to be here, but we actually recommend it so that you can get that super high level of assurance that not only is there a real person that you can tie to that account, but you can actually tie that the real person is really sitting there while they're trying to register for your services. So they take that picture, they take that selfie. We can get into it a little bit later, but it could also be a video so that you can make sure that there's liveness detected, to make sure that they didn't doctor a photo to make them look like someone else. But we can talk about the specifics of that later on if there's any questions that come up. But we force them to take that picture. So not only do you know that they're a real entity, you know that that real entity, that real person is actually the one sitting there trying to do this process, trying to sign up for your service. And then at the end there, you see a nice little picture. It has a registration page. I know it's a little bit hard to see, and my fault there on the slide, it doesn't actually have the data filled out in it. But the idea is now when the user sees their profile page, all the information is already there. We're reducing the keystrokes that the user actually has to type in to register for different services, whether it be a bank or whether it be retail or any other services that you might be providing to a customer. So, you know, why do customers need to change to this new generation? And I think I've outlined some of these already as we're going through, but just to bring them back up, in-person is outdated and expensive. No one's walking into brick and mortar stores anymore to sign up for bank accounts or to sign up for store credit cards. The traditional databases, here's one of the biggest issues right here. Most of the databases at this point have been compromised in one way or another. So one problem with putting all that database information up there in the cloud is we created a massive honeypot for anybody out there who wants to know anything about anyone. It was a huge collection, and a lot of those at this point in time, they've been dipped into several times. So it makes it where those questions that we used to ask, they're just not as good as they used to be. And again, if you do the easy KVAs that people can actually answer, you end up with a low assurance. And if you do the strong KVAs, the strong knowledge-based questions, the user might abandon the process because they don't actually have the information that you're trying to ask. It goes back to that, you know, what car do you own versus what was the mortgage on your house? The new generation kind of combines both of the goods, both of the pros of the previous generations. You get that document, you get that in-person sort of verification because you have that selfie. So you make sure that selfie matches up with the document. And you're also making sure that the person is sitting there in front of their computer, in front of their cell phone, trying to fill out this registration process or whatever process you're trying to put them through. But then you're also being able to reach back into other databases to make sure and validate the information that is on that government document. You can always reach back out and make sure that the driver's license is actually valid. You can reach back out to make sure that the address, which is registered in the DMV for that particular state, matches the address that you read off the driver's license. So you're getting a reach back into databases, but you're also getting something that augments that in-person side as well. It's a lot less friction for someone to take a picture of the front and back of their driver's license than it is for them to dig out paperwork to fill out what % their mortgage was for a house that they bought 10 years ago. And again, you're getting that high data integrity. So whenever that user account is created inside of your service, whether they're signing up for a bank, like I said, when you're creating that bank account, you actually know that the attributes that you're using to create that account go back to some anchor of trust. And that anchor of trust is the government ID. So you have that high data integrity versus whatever the user might have typed in at that time. Okay. So if you are familiar with the CIAM world and CIAM, then you've probably seen this circle before, or you know, pentagon in this case, but you've seen this before. This is the identity lifecycle management. In CIAM, we use it to talk about all the things that a user normally goes through in a process. I've augmented it a little bit so that it says registration, login, forgotten password, transact, and remove account. Or if any Europeans are on there, you know, your right to be forgotten. So I've augmented a little bit to kind of show you where Raas would actually fit in to this life cycle management that we're all used to seeing being CIAM people. So it's off to the left a little bit, as you can see, because we're actually feeding into that life cycle management. We're the ones that can help you kickstart that life cycle management. So if you were to do identity verification right at the very beginning, we fed your registration process. You've collected hopefully 100% of everything that you would normally ask from a client, but we've at least helped you collect a good chunk of it and reduce the keystrokes that a user had to type in. So registration as a service, identity verification, it's, again, document and biometric identity verification at registration provides an anchor of trust. And that's what we're trying to build here. We're trying to make sure that when we're protecting this account later on, the account itself was actually built on a good base, a good firm foundation. So some business benefits that you're getting here, and I've mentioned it over and over again, is that high data integrity, the strong security that comes with having a strong base. And we can talk about that in the next slide, where I've augmented the user lifecycle management a little bit more. And then also, there's some benefits to the customers themselves. Registration as a service identity verification combines document verification as well as biometric identity verification at registration is going to give you a very strong anchor of trust that that user really is who they say they are. It has benefits for both the business as well as the customer. So on the customer side, it's easier for them to sign up. They're getting a low barrier of entry. They're not going to have to type all of that information again and again. And it's also going to help protect their account later on. On the business side, they're getting validated attributes. So they know that these attributes have been validated by the government entity that gave out that document, but they're also going to have a stronger audit and security trail so that when that account gets attacked later on, and possibly a forgotten password attack, they actually have an anchor of trust that they can go back to protect that account and use that to make sure that it is the person who started the account resetting the password. So if I were to flip slides here, you can see again that I've brought up that augmented identity lifecycle management. We've already talked about how identity verification can help your CIAM process at the registration stage, helping you sign up those users and getting a strong base for those accounts that are being created. But now I've actually put it in a few more places in here, like forgotten password. And I've put in forgotten password on here as a little bit of a joke. And also something that we can all relate to. In the CIAM world, we all know that we're trying to move away completely from passwords. But at the end of the day, everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say a forgotten password flow. I've also put it on there for people who aren't familiar with CIAM. At least they can relate back to everyone's had to reset a password. And then there's also one down here at the transact for these very high risk transactions. Just to talk about that transaction one just a little bit before I move on from the slide. What we're kind of talking about here and bringing in identity proofing for a high risk transaction, we're not really talking about the normal high risk transactions that we're talking about for a normal user. So a lot of times in CIAM world or in CIAM world, when they say that they're going to do fine grain authorization or they're going to do push notifications for authorization for high risk transactions, they're talking about a type of high risk transaction where it's like, you know, Mickey doesn't normally transfer $100 out of his bank account. So when he does, I'm going to put a little stopgap in there and we're going to ask him to put his fingerprint down on his phone or re-trigger Face ID. And that's more of a stopgap for the user to kind of stop and say, wait a minute, is that really what I meant to do? The type of high-risk transactions that we're talking about that involve identity proofing are the ones where somebody's trying to completely close down a bank account and move $50,000 out, or move the entire amount out of the bank account into somewhere else through a wired transfer. You know, the super high-risk ones where once it's done, it's kind of done. If you wire out $50,000 of a bank account, it's completely gone. So you want to prove that it really is the user who started the account sitting there trying to make that transfer. So I do want to kind of cherry pick what I mean by high risk transactions, because there's a lot of you guys, when you saw transact right there and I said high risk transactions, you automatically thought, oh, that's a lot of friction for trying to transfer some money. We're not talking about the standard ones. We're talking about a little bit higher risk than that. But I do want to go back to that forgotten password scenario. And the reason I want to go back to that is because, like I said in CIAM, making a joke about forgotten passwords, we spend a lot of time right now trying to figure out what's the best multi-factor authentication, or how many other factors can I throw in there? Could it be a whole bunch of invisible factors, behavioral analytics to try to get rid of the password? Some of you guys are also familiar with FIDO flows. We try to push people to get YubiKeys so that we can have a strong authentication. Or, you know, bringing back the government again, you know, you got your CAP cards and your PIV cards to get that very strong authentication method, the strongest that you can actually have. But what happens when you lose them? What happens when the multi-factor, my phone, if I got one of those one-time password apps, what happens when I drop my phone and it's broken and I can't get in? Or what happens when I lose my YubiKey, especially the new ones, if you guys haven't seen them, the little bitty USB-C ones, they're so tiny. So if I pull that out of my computer and it gets lost in my bag, what am I going to do? How am I going to get back into my account? Identity verification can enable users to securely recredential themselves via biometrics. So if we think about what we talked about at the beginning with the registration, and that user went through that registration process trying to sign up for a bank account. So they took a picture of their driver's license, they took a picture of the front, they took a picture of the back, and that autofill kicked in and they didn't have to fill out any of that information. And now we have a picture of their ID on file. So they've been signing in, they've been using their account for a while, they triggered a YubiKey, and then they lost it. Well, at this point in time, usually what happens in a recredentialing, you fall back to the next best thing, the next factor. Well, in a lot of cases, they fall back to KBAs again. And sometimes it's the nice KBAs, like the identity proofing KBAs that are at least, you know, done against the database. And sometimes it's user set KBAs, you know, like what's your dog's favorite color? Well, in most security is like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. So if you spend a lot of time, you know, rolling out projects so that you can support these brand new forms of multi-factor and stronger authentications, you also have to spend some time investing in the mitigation route for when a user loses these. You know, if I have a YubiKey on my account, but a fraudster can go into my account, hit lost YubiKey, and they have to answer what's my dog's favorite color, then that account's no more secure than the KBA question. But if that account was created with registration as a service and identity verification built into the registration process like we've been talking about, then that forgot YubiKey button can actually trigger a selfie. So when I take a selfie or I do a liveness check at that point in time, we can actually compare that to the government document that was used as the anchor of trust at the birth of that account. So you see how these two things are starting to tie together. We've had a strong base for that account, a strong anchor of trust to create that account. And now whenever something goes wrong with that account, we can always go back to that strong anchor of trust. We don't have to worry about these user set KBAs anymore. You know, you always have to have a mitigating factor for your recredentialing or forgotten password that's just as strong as the factors that you're trying to force users to use. Doesn't make any sense for them not to be that way. So again, without IDV, a strong credential is only as strong as your mitigation route. We've already talked about the OTPs themselves. I'm sure quite a few of us have lost OTPs, or if you're like me, broken a phone or two. So guys, that's actually all the material that I had prepared for you today on today's presentation. I hope you guys have started to see or started to think about some new use cases where identity verification and identity proofing no longer has that bad taste in your mouth or that bad connotation when it comes to CIAM processes. And I'm hoping that, you know, just a little bit of curiosity has been spiked in your head so that you can start thinking about, maybe this actually can enhance our processes and enhance our user experience so that we can drive better security, but at the same time, provide our users with something that's a registration process that's a little less frictionful than what we thought it would be if we try to add in identity proofing. So I want to thank you all for your time today, and I hope it's been useful.
Well, Mickey, thank you very much for today's presentation. We do really appreciate your time. We've had a couple of questions that have come in from our audience, and maybe you can spend just a few minutes addressing a few of these points. And one of the first questions that we had that came in is, can you talk through the impact of registration as a service as well as CIAM integrity?
Yeah, so the impact of registration as a service, to be honest with you, this is kind of new to the industry. Like I said, a lot of people keep thinking about identity proofing in the old ways. So we're actually working those identity proofing processes back into registration now that we have the new generation of identity verification processes. So far what we've seen in the few customers that have been able to go through this is that it actually is not making their drop-off rate worse. They're not having more users abandon it because they have to take a picture of their front and back of their driver's license. Users are actually starting to get more used to having to take pictures of something when they're registering. We've all seen it with when you're signing up for Apple Wallet, you have to take a picture of your credit card. We've also seen it with Amazon and other places now when you're trying to register a gift card. So in users' mind, it's something that's not outside the norm anymore. So when you introduce taking a picture of your driver's license inside the registration process, it doesn't come as a shock to them, and they're also more willing to do it.
And another question too that came in, kind of along the same lines, is how do you convince customers to supply that doc when they do register? What do you need to do to kind of bring them on board for all
that? So convincing them to do it is always the fun part. I think it also depends on what industry we're talking about. So if we're talking about a bank and we're talking about FinServe, where you're signing up for a trading platform, it's a lot easier to convince customers that they need to do this because they kind of understand and they're already expecting that type of security or that type of identity verification for you to sign up for those services. So it's easier to convince them to do it there because it's kind of do you want to take a picture of your driver's license or do you want to go through this old process? And they know the old processes of identity proofing. Or do they actually want to drive in and go to a bank? So that's the easy one. When it comes to the other side of the world, when it comes to, we're talking about more like hospitality and retail, it gets a little bit harder and demanding. It gets a little bit harder to convince the user to do something that they are not used to doing. So a lot of the times what I see people doing is trying to add it to some type of incentive. So it's like, oh, if you go ahead and proof your identity now, we can provide you with a better level of service. So I've seen things like money transfer places where it's not exactly a FinServe, and traditionally they didn't have a lot of security around people signing up for those accounts to wire things out. I've seen them being able to add it in and they're turning around and saying, all right, well, if you go ahead and do identity verification, gives pictures of your driver's license and stuff, we'll go ahead and waive a certain percentage of the transfer fee on this one. And then that way they've got that user. So every time they come back, they have a real entity, a real person that they can track back to in that account. So it just kind of depends on the industry. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and another question that came in from our audience is, what does the integration process look like for a company using a more traditional identity and access management setup?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the companies that you saw on my profile at the very beginning, those would be your newer versions of the traditional identity and access management setup. There's also some older ones, but we'll try not to talk about those. So the companies that you saw on there, the new version of CIAM, they're ready built for different plugins and working with different vendors to provide different parts of the lifecycle management. They understand that they are the core engine behind everything, but they can't provide everything. You know, the ForgeRock, the transmits, pings, and octaves of the world, they can't do everything when it comes to identity. So they've made it very easy to be able to plug into. So a lot of times the integration is as easy as installing the plugin inside of your CIAM platform that you're currently using and just configuring it. If they weren't going to do that, let's say that they don't have a CIAM commercial off-the-shelf product and people just wanted to know what's the integration like, These platforms are usually integrated by using an SDK, a native SDK that you can embed the capture functionalities inside of your own application that you're, if you're a bank and you have your bank app, you can use the SDK and embed the capture functionalities directly in your bank app. They don't need to, download special apps for this. And they also have the JavaScript SDK so that you can embed it right into your web flows. So whether you have a commercial off-the-shelf CIAM platform already, the integration's easy. And if you don't, it's just as easy as embedding an SDK in the apps that you already present to your users.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, Mickey. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions for today. I want to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of their busy schedule to attend today's session. I trust that today's discussion provided some data points to enable your institution to best be prepared to tackle customer identity and access management. Of course, if you do have a follow-up question, please submit it through the chat window and we'll follow up later. We hope once again to see you at one of our upcoming events. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Scott Ferguson.